Hello and welcome to another episode of Great Women in Compliance with Hemma and Lisa Fine. Today we are joined by Mary Inman and Liz Soltan from Whistleblower Partners LLP, a boutique public interest law firm dedicated to representing individuals who expose corporate fraud and misconduct. This episode explores the recent revisions to the DOJ's Corporate Whistleblower Awards CWA Pilot Program, highlighting the expanded focus area and the role of whistleblowers in uncovering corporate misconduct. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our esteemed guests, Mary and Liz, to share their experiences and perspectives on these developments. So, first, Mary, our good friend, is a partner at Whistleblower Partners, as we've said. She's got 30 years of experience representing whistleblowers under various US and international programs. Notably, Mary has represented whistleblowers in high profile cases involving Theranos and Facebook. And then Liz, she's an associate Whistleblower Partners. She focuses on financial fraud, anti-money laundering, and sanctions evasion cases. She's a former Skadden Fellow with a background in public interest law. Mary and Liz, welcome to GWIT. We're so happy to have you join us here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So we are so excited to see you and to speak with you. We love hearing about how you got to what you're doing today. So can we start, Mary, with what inspired you to specialize and represent whistleblowers?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I went to law school with this amorphous idea that I wanted to change the world, which sounds really naive, but I think a lot of lawyers go to law school in this way. And I realized that lawyers were really always in the room where it happened, to quote Hamilton. And so it was really my grabbing around for or reaching to try and figure out how I was going to accomplish that. And I was just really fortunate to have my first law firm job be at a firm representing whistleblowers. And so it was really this quest for finding a way to get at justice and what I've learned at achieving justice and meting out justice. And what I've learned is that really whistleblowers are the most effective way to supercharge enforcement efforts. So I fell into it, but it's been 30 years of a serendipitous experiment with the expansion of whistleblower programs, and I've just been really fortunate.
30 years of being in the room where it happens. I love that. You set the with the Hamilton quotes. We're going to see if we can match that. Liz, I love to ask origin stories. So what was it that brought you into compliance and whistleblower advocacy?
So it was also a bit of serendipity. I went to law school thinking that I was going to be a public interest lawyer in the legal aid context. I had done some work related to that before law school. And I did a Skadden Fellowship for 2 years, and that was ending. And I was looking for another public interest oriented job and learned about an opportunity to become a whistleblower lawyer. And I thought, this is an interesting way to get at the truth, to help empower people, and to hold corporations accountable. And it has been a fun journey since then. I'm glad that I fell into it too.
You're so right. It really is so necessary that we get to the truth. Justice is one thing, but truth is almost its own animal. I love that. I love that emphasis. Mary, could you talk to us a little bit about your work with international whistleblowers and the challenges involved there?
Yeah, that's been a real privilege. I was able to live in London from 2017 to 2020. And I recognize that, as often is the case with Americans, we can be insular and not necessarily looking outward. So when we planted a flag in London with our London office, it really signaled that we were more internationally focused. And we, instead of getting just clients from the UK and Europe, they started coming to us from Asia, Africa, from throughout the globe. And the challenges that presents, first of all, the benefits were enormous because, as we all know, especially a lot of people in your audience work at multinational companies and we are in a global marketplace. So it's hubris to think that the only good information comes from people in the United States. So we started to see, and especially back when the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was being enforced, maybe when the pause is lifted, it'll be enforced again. But by definition, that fraud is occurring overseas. When you're bribing a foreign government official, it's not happening in America. So I think what was really rewarding was really the education campaign that need to happen to let people know, because even in America, folks don't know about all the reward programs, let alone when you get across the pond and other far stretches. So really what I got to do was a lot of education and then a huge cultural awareness campaign in terms of what the perception is of whistleblowers across the globe. And it's very different. Like in Europe, of course, I think Germany and France in particular, also Italy, strong resistance given some residue left over, obviously, from a World War II history, that term is very loaded. So I think I had to develop a real sensitivity around it. And then there's also, we could do a whole episode on this. There's also a perception that Americans are overly mercenary and overly transactional. So there was a resistance, particularly in the UK, that it's not a British sensibility, it's not British, it's not cricket, as they like to say, to get paid, because the idea is we're British, we speak up because it's the right thing to do. So I found like I was navigating a landscape that was really new to me, but very exciting. They remain international whistleblowers an enormous source of information, but it's important to know the cultural landscape you're stepping into.
Liz, how did your experience as a Skadden Fellow influence your current practice and what you're doing now?
So as a Skadden Fellow, I worked in my hometown of Philadelphia, representing low-income Philadelphians in employment and public benefits matters. And nowadays, besides financial fraud work, I also do some healthcare fraud-related cases. And it's been helpful to me to have a sense of a little bit of righteous indignation, seeing the amount of fraud that there is in the healthcare space, with insurance companies really exploiting government programs to make as much money as they can out of them, while there are so many people, especially poor people, who don't have access to healthcare at all in the US. So that has been a real motivating factor for me in terms of seeking accountability for corporate bad actors, keeping in mind that these acts of wrongdoing do affect everyday people, and that injustice at the top really translates to a lot of suffering across the board.
And it's interesting to see how things keep playing out in that area. And I'm sure there's always more to come, which is an excellent segue into what we want to do a bit of a deep dive into today, which is the revised whistleblower, corporate whistleblower program for the DOJ. I think it's interesting. I was surprised, just in my view, that they came out with more refining that with other things going on. But now that's out there, I was just hoping you all could give us an overview, in your opinion, of what's the key points, what's in there, just since you probably have read it with a fine-tooth comb at this point. So kick it to you.
I'll take a start, and then Liz will pick up anything I missed, which I'm sure I will. As you said, on just the significance of the expansion is that I think a lot of us, given that there's been a pause to the FCPA, the Corporate Transparency Act, a lot of changes in emphasis, made a lot of us worry that we weren't even sure that the Corporate Whistleblower Award Pilot Program was going to survive. And it's new, as folks may recall. It was adopted in August of 2024. And it was really an interesting program because the SEC whistleblower program, as we all know, came out of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act. But DOJ created this program out of whole cloth. They have the power. They didn't have to get legislative approval. They have the power from their forfeiture statutes to pay rewards to confidential informants. So they brought this program forward. As it says in the name, as it says on the tin, it's only a 3-year program to pressure test this, see if it works. And I always say that I think the program exists because DOJ frankly had FOMO that all these other agencies were getting tips. The DOJ has always had the False Claims Act since the Civil War, but that is a very different animal, and it doesn't get at a huge number of other types of frauds and wrongdoing. And so it was really a gap-filling measure. And so I wanted to give that background to give context for why this expansion is significant, because The program in August of 2024, one of the big gaps they sought to fill was with the FCPA. They have joint jurisdiction with the SEC. And so for publicly traded companies, the SEC could pay whistleblowers. But if you were seeing bribery in privately held companies, whistleblowers couldn't bring that information. And we'd seen that. Whistleblowers would actually turn away because as these rewards seek to provide a financial safety net under people and really tip the balance in the risk reward calculus, that it's a very difficult act. And if you're going to do a free fall, which is what it often is to speak up in your industry, it's nice to have a safety net underneath. So it was very reassuring to those of us in the whistleblower space to see that the Trump administration actually not only didn't put a pause on this program or just let it languish, but instead expanded it. So it endorsed the existing program and then expanded it. And to us, that's really significant because it's in the tradition of recognizing that, as Chuck Grassley would say, who's the champion of the False Claims Act and champion of all whistleblower programs, that prosecuting fraud without a whistleblower is like, to his Iowa home state, threshing corn with a rusty pair of scissors. If you want to enforce fraud, there's no substitute for having a well-placed insider to give you the roadmap. And so that's clearly what the Trump administration is recognizing here. So I will talk really quickly about one of the expanded areas, and then I know Liz is our sanctions maven, so maybe she can talk about that. But I'll talk about the tariff expansion. So obviously, with the Trump administration's priority on tariffs and quote unquote leveling the playing field in global commerce, one of the areas that they expanded is they said whistleblowers can now bring tips about tariff and export violations. So I think really, really significant. You can this ability already exists under the False Claims Act, right? If you're avoiding customs duties, then you're not paying monies owed to the government. It's called a reverse false claim. So there's nothing super new there, but I think the really interesting thing for your audience is that export control violations arguably are now going to be covered, and whistleblowers can now bring that information forward. And that's a big deal, as we know, because the Trump administration is very concerned with what American companies are exporting to China and to Iran and other countries like that in terms of dual use technologies that may give them a leg up in the AI arms race or just in dual military uses. So drones and other things. And of course, AI is synonymous with advancing military causes too. So chips and other things like that, I think we're going to start to see a lot more enforcement in that area, and they're really welcome. The 1,000-foot view on this is that they want whistleblowers to help them enforce that. Liz, do you want to talk about a couple of the other expansions?
Sure. So as Mary said, one of the other expansion areas relates to sanctions violations. This is another expansion that reaffirms the commitment to the importance of whistleblowers, but also is adding on to an existing program. So the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network already does have a whistleblower program that awards whistleblowers who bring forward information about sanctions violations, sales in contravention of sanctions. The DOJ program was initially brought out as a gap filler program, creating eligibility for whistleblowers who were maybe not eligible under other programs. And this is an area where it's reinforcing an existing whistleblower program under FinCEN. And what we would advise potential whistleblowers is, if you're not sure which program to submit under, you can do both. The DOJ Corporate Whistleblower Pilot instructions explicitly say that you can go ahead and do that and submit to multiple whistleblower programs. And I think this is the fact that it's explicitly added on is just a signal to the public that sanctions violations continue to be an area of interest for government enforcement.
Yeah, and I would add that particularly, obviously, sanctions as to, again, China and Iran, and that we keep hearing with Russia, I think that's a little different. Trump keeps dangling that they may get a pass and not included. So I would narrow it even further into, I think if we're talking about sanctions and violations that relate to Iran and China, then that's the territory we're in.
100%.
A lot of the people that are listening to this as compliance professionals are thinking like, how does this, both the direct implications, as you've mentioned, for whistleblowers, but what about in terms of some of the bigger picture of the bribery, anti-corruption? Is there any change in focus? We've all gone with business as usual. I think many of us would have said, if any of these things are going wrong, we will address them now. But what other practical implications, if any, do you see for those of us living in the weeds?
Yeah, so those of you living in the weeds, I would say that with every new presidential administration, there are different enforcement priorities. I just think here it's a little bit more unusual because we haven't seen statutes being paused, like traditional statutes like the FCPA. I think I would not retreat from my FCPA work in terms of bribery because, as we know, the pause may get lifted, and I don't know where we are. We're maybe we probably got 4 more months before we know if it will get lifted. So stay tuned. But in the meantime, we've watched other countries step into the void, right? So space abhors a vacuum. And so the UK and France and Switzerland have said that they've got a joint task force. And so to the extent that we're talking about multinationals, just because the US has paused doesn't mean that other players aren't stepping into the void. I think that I would advise you do what we do, which is we're trying to see where are the enforcement resources going to be poured. And so that doesn't mean that you don't want, obviously we all know that the culture of compliance is really important. But in terms of if you're going to add more resources on particular areas to beef up your compliance, I do think that sanctions, procurement, and in particular, what you're doing with import-export is going to be really important. The other area that they haven't backed away from for any of your clients in healthcare, we have watched a continuation. In fact, I think one of the more significant developments coming out of the Trump DOJ was a criminal case against United Health Group. We don't see criminal cases in Medicare Advantage very often. Frankly, we don't see criminal cases in healthcare very often, not against big insurers. We do against individual bad doctors who've gone rogue. So that's another trend I've been seeing, is that certain areas it's going to be business as usual. Certainly healthcare fraud is one of them. But I just thought it was interesting to see that it's even amped up as to United, which is a very big player.
Yeah.
And I would also, I'm sorry, Hemma.
Okay, go.
Good.
I was also going to say, I know already in the compliance world, you're no fans of cartels, as are none of us, but there's a lot of talk about transnational criminal organizations, money laundering specifically, that facilitates cartel activity, a lot of talk about enforcement of drug trafficking, narcotics. That seems to be a real hot button issue that I suspect enforcement will really focus on. Again, I don't think that's a change for any of you. The press around the rollout of these expanded programs has talked explicitly about the desire to prod and prompt organizations to have more intensive internal compliance efforts. So I think this is actually a really good time for you all to point to the need for more resources for your work. And to say in the guidance around this expansion, they've explicitly said that this, quote, may also motivate corporations to create more robust compliance programs. So this is a real signal to all of you out there to ring the bell that your work is important and it's being recognized.
I love what Liz said, because I did want to emphasize that I'm sure to a lot of people in your audience, they're like, cartels, we are not in the business of cartels. Like that is something that would never touch corporate America. I do want to highlight that there was a case brought by a whistleblower named Michael Woodford, who was the first non-Japanese CEO of Olympus Corporation. And the case that he exposed basically involved money laundering inside the organization that related to the Japanese mafia. So when you say it can't happen to you, like there were a lot of money was moving through nail salons and ceramics companies and traditional things that you'd see in money laundering. And that's a major corporation. So I wouldn't get too comfortable in thinking that this isn't something that happens to big multinationals.
No comfort here whatsoever. As a compliance professional, I take your point. I love the framing of this is an opportunity to lean in and ask for more resources. It's also an opportunity to clean up house, to your point, right? You don't want to be waiting till a whistleblower publicly announces what's under the covers. You want to be doing that systematically. So I love that call to action. I love that you tell us that there are real cases out there. It's not just a government initiative. It's not just the current administration's priorities. It does definitely signal that, but certainly gives us some indication of where the next issues might be and to look around corners for that. It's the stuff of movies, really, isn't it? And terrible, I say that, but these are interesting cases. And I always used to say the word whistleblower gets a bad name sometimes because of the movies, because that free fall that you mentioned, Mary, is always perpetuated in these movies. And we do need to think about how we treat whistleblowers and think about it as a gift, really, rather than a threat or a burden on resources. Mary, I know you've represented many interesting people, many interesting cases, and I don't know what you can talk about here, but I'd love to hear a bit more about those cases. We know there's lots of high profile things in the news. Frances Hagen obviously was a whistleblower. Sarah Wynne Williams is also a high profile whistleblower. What can you tell us about these high profile cases and the impact of these disclosures on corporate accountability? Does it make a difference?
It does make a difference. Just talking about Facebook is really interesting here because when Frances Haugen, who is our client, first reported, and that was known as the Facebook files, right? What she has done is a lesson for what is now playing out in the AI industry. So I think we're all waiting to figure out who's going to be the next Frances Haugen for AI, because there's complete parallels that we're not regulating yet. We didn't regulate social media. We still really, frankly, haven't. The story with Frances was one of culture, that even though there weren't laws that there were some laws that Facebook was violating, but it was much like big tobacco, right? Where they were sitting on research the same way big tobacco was, that they knew that tobacco would be harming children, but they still had Joe Camel and all of that being directed at children. What Frances was able to show, among many things, is that they knew for ROI that if they were putting like body dysmorphic content targeted towards middle school age children, that would increase engagement. And then that's the metric that investors looked at for their profitability. Was there anything necessarily illegal in that? Not necessarily, but what she did was do what all of us are doing right now and say, ick. That is really gross and horrible what was going on there. And by dint of her exposing it, then the conversation was had. And frankly, she testified in front of Congress, as we know, but she also went to the EU, and the EU actually, she testified there as well. And I think made more of an impact in the EU in terms of their legislation. So I feel a little bit like the story here is one of that history is destined to repeat itself. And it's a very different Facebook meta that Sarah Wynne Williams encountered than that Frances did. At that time, when Frances reported around 2021, there was no talk of saying she violated her NDA or took more documents than she should have, or any of those sorts of things that a company regularly can use as trumped up claims as part of their playbook. But that is not what we've seen. They've come out swinging as to Sarah Wynne Williams. And I think a lot of that has to do with a larger culture that I think they can get away with that we don't want to regulate AI as a country, and because we think that regulation somehow is going to put us at a competitive disadvantage. So there should be no guardrails and do whatever you want. And so that's where I think the lessons from Frances and Sarah Wynne Williams are that it's really dangerous to speak up when we don't have laws saying what the company is doing is illegal. It's just trying to expose something that we think is morally reprehensible. For Sarah Wynne Williams, they not only are threatening her with NDA violations, but also had a restraining order to stop her, as we all know, from publicizing her book. And then that, of course, be careful what you do, because that created the Streisand effect. And I don't know about you all, but a lot of people have that book now.
That's right.
So I guess my lessons there are that we still rely heavily on whistleblowers to hold up a mirror and reflect back to the world of what these companies are up to. And we're all the much better for it, because it sparks these really important conversations. And I would say, so Francis is certainly saying these days, I'm speaking from your future you, that where this is going to repeat itself with AI. And in a way, whistleblowers, it feels even more dangerous for whistleblowers to speak up in this space. We have seen the OpenAI whistleblowers. We saw 13 whistleblowers speak up. In fact, their NDA violated the SEC rules, and Sam Altman said, oops, I didn't know, which I thought was rather disingenuous. Of course, we knew that we wanted to keep them quiet. So it's still a dangerous time for whistleblowers, but their role could not be any more important.
So important. I really don't like that it's the narrative still how dangerous the time it is for whistleblowers, given what the whistleblowers are giving us in terms of the risks they're taking and the information they're giving us. It's not ever just about a payout for a whistleblower, as you've been describing. I think Sarah Wynne Williams' book is called Careless People, and you juxtapose that against these brands that say they're companies that care. And what does caring mean now? It's not just about legality. I love that you highlight that. It's about caring when you're building the tech of the future. And we talked about tech. I know there's other industries that are implicated. Liz, you talked about working in healthcare previously. Can you share your insights when we work on financial fraud, healthcare fraud, even settlements relating to money laundering? What impact are you seeing of these whistleblowers in the industries that you work in?
Often whistleblowers are folks who have tried so hard to get their message across internally and have been ignored again and again. I think that's a clear pattern that holds true across these different issue areas, from healthcare to financial fraud. And the companies don't always listen, and then they become that big cautionary tale. Like there was the huge enforcement against TD Bank. The complaint in that case has a picture of someone putting a duffel bag full of cash onto the counter at the bank. And it seems like those sorts of things couldn't happen routinely, or that absolutely that would raise red flags within the company. But often it really doesn't, because the people who are at the top of the hierarchy aren't listening to complaints from people like bank tellers who are saying, oh, we're really uncomfortable doing business with this person. You seem to not be noticing that we're repeatedly raising red flags about these transactions. And it's only after the fact, when you have a big kind of blow up like that case, that other big players start to take notice. So I think there is a big impact from seeing these kind of example cases where there's a big enforcement action. But for every example like that, you can assume that there are many others in the industry who are doing similar things and just haven't been caught yet. Or maybe people at the top don't realize that's going on. And one of the best ways they have to get that information is to make it possible and make it safe for whistleblowers to bring that to them, because whistleblowers could be at any level of the organization, and often people who are more on the front lines really have that information to share that's crucial for companies to course correct.
Oh, I'd love to ask you a few more questions about this, Liz and Mary, because this is really important for our listeners, the compliance professionals. We talk about building that culture, that safety, that psychological safety, having not just mechanisms, but as you said, the actual safety once you use the mechanisms to speak up and let us know. But there are also other forces inside the company that, as you said, don't want to hear or don't want to believe what's being brought up. I don't know if it's a defensive litigation posture. So I've got my hunches, but I'd love to ask you both, if I may, what is it? Why are companies not listening to people when they're trying to talk internally? Maybe start with you, Liz, and then Mary, have some comments from you.
Sure. So in the TD Bank example, the part of the resistance to that message was that it was going to be costly to beef up their ability to detect and deal with money laundering red flags. And there was this sense that it wasn't worth it to invest in that they didn't have the staff, they didn't have the resources, and they didn't want to allocate resources in that direction. And I think that is a trend that Mary and I and our colleagues see again and again. We'll have clients who come to us and say, I brought this up with my manager. They actually understood that there was a problem. They believed me when I said that, but when they tried to go to the next level up and say, hey, we need resources to deal with this, it's going to cost money to make changes, things were just shut down. And the cost benefit analysis is often not correctly weighted to understand the human cost of non-compliance. And also, ultimately, when you do get caught, because it's usually a when, not an if, the cost that you're going to face in terms of fines, enforcement, forfeiture. So I think the bottom line is often what folks in power point to as a reason not to listen. And then one other trend that we see is there's a sense of trying to keep what could be seen as embarrassing or damaging information as closely protected as possible, so that even after someone makes a complaint through an ethics hotline, say, there isn't follow-up with them to tell them that the company has begun an investigation or what they're doing or what the disposition of it is. And that's understandable because there is a sense that you don't want to share sensitive information widely. You don't want to add to risk for that person by letting it become a subject of gossip that they've come forward. But on the other hand, employees don't feel good about coming forward with information about a problem if they think that it's going into a black hole and they never know what happens after that.
So important. Yes. Mary, any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with Liz, and I would even wind it back to a psychoanalysis to a medieval times, that since medieval times we've talked about we shoot the messenger. You put your head above the parapet, you get your head shut off. And I think that's just a dispositionally, we all know that every culture, and this was interesting in my international work where I would learn the different names for snitches, grassers, daubers, daubing out, like every culture has a different word. And in fact, the term whistleblower will often be loaded with that kind of negative thought. And so for me, I think the reason companies often aren't listening is because it's a natural human instinct to get in a defensive crouch when someone says you've done something wrong. And that's where we've become more evolved, and thank goodness for the compliance space that we teach people about what it means to have a growth mindset, and these are opportunities to course correct. But it doesn't matter what industry we're talking about. So I guess that should make people feel better, that there's no industry that is really great at listening to whistleblowers. We all get in a defensive crouch, and then I think it really takes a lot of training and reprogramming to get away from our childhood snitches, stereotypes, and start leaning into the social behavioral science from folks like Christian Hunt, where it basically shows that not only are these people not disloyal, they're among your most loyal employees. And in fact, they're the canaries in the coal mine that help you, as Liz said, course correct. So the problem is that it's not only don't shoot the messenger, it's also there's just such a temptation to then look into the personality of the whistleblower. So in a way, I love going back to the British idea of whistleblowing, some of their origin stories, that you blew the whistle if you were in police to bring reinforcements to come look at the problem. Nobody looked at the police officer who blew the whistle and got everybody else to come look. And I think that is the tendency, is that we get distracted because it's easier to make it about the messenger rather than about the message. And so I would really caution people and a lot of our clients, there's really interesting research that people who are neurodiverse are more likely to report. They're not picking up on the social cues, things like that. So I think there's a temptation. They're like, oh, George, he's always complaining about everything. And I think people really need to wind back that and do what an investigator does, which is let's look at the information, let's see if it can be corroborated. So that's, I think, a little bit about what goes on. And I think that, as Lisa knows, I love to cite this statistic, is that the SEC is amazing in terms of the data it collects, and they do their annual report to Congress as they're required to. And that one of their recent reports, for years, they've stopped doing this, which I need to get them to correct, but they would figure out, of the whistleblowers who received rewards, how many reported internally first. And it was routinely 80%, 80 or 81%. So this idea that you're listening at these companies is not true. And the biggest frauds where people got paid monies because it was successful, those people tried and you weren't listening. So I think we really need, as companies, to invest in teaching people how to listen up, but also reprogramming ourselves of our biases.
Yeah.
Here are the biases we have when someone speaks up, that we get defensive and we don't see it as an opportunity for growth.
That's 100% agree. And I will just say, you remind me of the framing of the villain and the hero and the guide in the movies, where we find companies making the whistleblower the villain and trying to make the whistleblower villain, inadvertently ends up in you being the villain, right? You're the one victimizing the whistleblower. Whereas actually what the whistleblower is doing is acting as a guide to allow you, the corporation, to be the hero in your own story. Now, that is the opportunity, that is the gift. When they speak up as a guide and blow the whistle and let you say, look a little bit closer. The beautiful thing about this is you have agency to be that hero in your own story first. And we don't get anywhere near the DOJ if you have that attitude. So I love that framing. Lisa,
the other thing I would love to drop in the show notes too is there's a great study by Stephen Steubens and Kyle Welch, where they not only show that it's important to listen to whistleblowers, they show that it actually has a positive effect on your profits if you listen. So they took Navex Global's data set, anonymized, and they were able to show companies with hotlines that ring off the hook, meaning people feel safe enough to speak, are more profitable, avoid more litigation than companies have a silent hotline. So if you need proof in the pudding, there is proof in an increasing number of studies that show that this risk management tool, or as Christian Hunt says, whistleblowers are forward indicators of risk. If you let them indicate the risk and correct, you're going to make more money.
yes.
I'm just going to jump in with a point about this that I have been, as you're talking, I think even when people raising concerns, I think one of the other problems we have is that managers may not take it seriously or just decide it's their own risk and either not escalate or handle it in the way they think is appropriate for various reasons, because they might not want to escalate or other things. So I think sometimes when we talk about, I think there's a gap within there that us in compliance may not know about this, and a person comes to you and someone else says, I raised it to my manager, this person and that. So I think one of the important parts is, I think there are parts of most companies that are willing to listen. I think there's also challenges from a cultural standpoint where, especially in some countries, it's like we're family first in our local office, so we'll fix our problems, which isn't good. And I think, and some of that can include where we get into retaliation or other things. So I think one thing I just wanted to raise in there is some of these things are in a much different level than necessarily, because we have 80%, how many of those actually went to the compliance department or whatever. And that is something that, things that keep me up at night are, do people understand it, and how will they actually address these things proactively and recognize that that approach doesn't work.
I love it. And I would say that one of the stats that I would love to have, but we never see, is how many times has the compliance departments at Pearson and other places actually course corrected. We don't have the data on how many we've avoided. And I think that's a really important point, because I feel like compliance is, at least as a whistleblower lawyer, I see compliance as a whistleblower's number one ally, because in a way, compliance itself is speaking up to the company regularly. So there's a bit of an alignment there, and knows that you often have to say the unpopular thing, the inconvenient truth.
And facts are facts. And sometimes I say that to people, like, tell me what, just don't sugarcoat, because a course correct, I wouldn't even necessarily, a course correct is part of what we try to do in work all the time. That should be part of what we're doing. We do that with business strategy. We do it to make it similar. But in any event, I think that part is a really interesting way to keep thinking. And with that, I'm going to just jump to this question about some of the future outlook and advice you might have for us. And Hemma, I'll kick it over to you for that.
Lovely. Mary, what trends do you foresee then for whistleblower programs and enforcement actions? We've got some signals here, but what do you think is happening around the corner when it comes to this space?
Yeah, so I think that certainly in the United States, we're getting our cues on enforcement is going to be very heavy in the import-export space and the sanction space and money laundering cartels. We've seen a lot of that. Healthcare will remain constant. What I would like to say is that for those multinationals, and I know there are a lot of them out there in your audience, we're really starting to see other countries pick up the mantle on this idea of whistleblower rewards, and UK right now is a particular hotspot. So if I am crystal balling, we know that the Labour government in the UK has decided that they've set a target for themselves of closing the tax gap by about $8 billion. And they now have they took a discretionary whistleblower reward program and made it mandatory. So for the first time, we've seen them, after a lot of its initial resistance to becoming Americanized, deciding that this is something they want to do. And they're right behind on the heels of that. I predict we're going to see it coming out of their Serious Frauds Office, out of their financial regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, and even more broadly as to sanctions. So I would say that even though you think that maybe bribery is not being forced in the US using whistleblowers, other countries are now seeing the light that whistleblowers are keys to enforcement, and really make sure that, like I said, any prosecutor would rather pick up a file where there's a whistleblower than one where there isn't, because the whistleblower does most of the work for them.
That's right. Liz, any final advice for the compliance officers on the listening to us today for what they should be doing to be prepared for increased whistleblower activity?
Get ready to listen to whistleblowers. Think about ways that you can create a culture of safety and follow through so that people know they're not just screaming into the abyss. And especially when it comes to issues within the US, be ready for a lot of scrutiny on anything that you're doing that has to do with China.
Very nice. Lisa, over to you to close us out.
First of all, thank you both so much for being here. I always learn a ton in these discussions. It's very practical for us to be thinking about within our organizations, and this idea of the whistleblower and reframing it. And that's huge. And also in this time where we've got a lot of uncertainty, I think certain things remain the same. And I really appreciate you all giving us the insight and the new stuff going forward. And just, we're so grateful to have this ongoing conversation with you all, and we'll probably keep bringing you back as long as you're willing to do it. Thank you, Liz and Mary and Hemma. And on behalf of the Compliance Podcast Network, Corporate Compliance Insights, thanks for listening and have a great day.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet. Every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.